I got my dream job at an Australian marketing firm's New York office. The salary was excellent, the position was senior level, and I was thrilled. Within 3 weeks, I was fired. Not because I did bad work, but because I couldn't handle what they called brutal honesty and what I called workplace bullying. In my first meeting, my Australian boss told me my presentation was lazy and showed lack of effort. My coworkers openly criticized my ideas in front of clients, calling them boring and uninspired. When I went to HR to report hostile work environment, they laughed and said, "That's just Australian workplace culture. Direct feedback builds better teams." I said direct feedback is one thing, publicly humiliating employees is another. They said I was too sensitive for their culture and let me go. This is the story of how I lost my dream job because an Australian company brought their brutal honesty policy to America without realizing it's not honesty, it's cruelty disguised as feedback. My name is Rachel, and I've worked in marketing for 8 years. I'm good at my job, have great references, and had never been fired before. When I got recruited for a senior marketing position at an Australian firm expanding to New York, I was excited. The salary was 30% higher than my previous job. The role had more responsibility and creativity. The interview process was tough, but I impressed them. They offered me the position immediately. My first day, I noticed the office culture was different. People spoke bluntly to each other in ways that seemed harsh. I heard a manager tell an employee her work was shit and needed to be completely redone. The employee didn't seem upset, just nodded and went back to her desk. I was shocked. At my previous jobs, managers gave constructive criticism privately and diplomatically. This felt aggressive and mean. My boss was Mark, an Australian who'd been with the company for 15 years. In our first one-on-one meeting, I presented my ideas for a new client campaign. I'd spent hours preparing, researching the client's brand, and creating a comprehensive strategy. When I finished presenting, Mark looked at me and said, "That's pretty lazy, Rachel. Looks like you threw this together last minute without much thought." Not impressed. I was stunned. I'd put significant effort into that presentation. I tried to explain my thought process and the research I'd done. Mark cut me off and said, "I don't need excuses. I need better work. This isn't good enough for our standards. Go back and do it properly." I left his office fighting back tears. I'd never been spoken to like that by a manager. It felt humiliating and unfair. I talked to my coworker Jenna, who'd been at the company for 6 months. She was American too. I asked if Mark's feedback style was normal. She said yes, and it took her months to adjust. She said Australian workplace culture values direct, blunt feedback without sugarcoating. They see it as respectful because they're not wasting your time with diplomatic language. I said, "It doesn't feel respectful. It feels mean." She said, "You get used to it or you leave." Several American employees had already left because they couldn't handle it. The second incident happened in a client meeting. We were presenting campaign concepts to a new client. I presented one of my ideas, which the client seemed interested in. My coworker Dave, an Australian, immediately said in front of the client, "That idea is pretty boring, mate. We can do better than that." Then he presented his own idea, basically undermining me in front of the client. The client looked uncomfortable. I was mortified. After the meeting, I pulled Dave aside and told him it was inappropriate to criticize my work in front of clients. He looked confused and said he was just being honest. The idea wasn't strong, so he said so. I said there's a time and place for feedback, and in front of clients, isn't it? He said that's American corporate bullshit. In Australia, if something's not good, you say it's not good. You don't pretend it's fine and then talk behind people's backs later. I said I wasn't asking him to lie, just to be professional. He walked away laughing and muttering about Americans being too sensitive. The breaking point came in a team meeting. We were brainstorming for a major campaign. I pitched an idea I was excited about. Mark immediately said, "That's genuinely one of the worst ideas I've heard in months. Did you even think about the target demographic?" Other Australian team members laughed. One said, "Yeah, that's pretty bad." "Rachel?" I felt my face turn red. I tried to defend the idea, explaining the strategy behind it. Mark cut me off again and said, "Stop defending bad work and start producing good work." I left that meeting and went straight to HR. I told them I was experiencing workplace bullying and hostile work environment. The way Mark and other team members spoke to me was unacceptable. I gave specific examples of being called lazy, having my work called shit, being undermined in front of clients, and being publicly humiliated in meetings. The HR manager, an Australian woman named Sophie, listened and then said something that shocked me. She said, "Rachel, what you're describing is normal feedback in our company culture. We value direct, honest communication. We don't believe in softening feedback or protecting people's feelings. If your work isn't good enough, we tell you directly so you can improve. That's not bullying. That's helping you grow." I said publicly humiliating employees isn't helping them grow. She said, "You're interpreting directness as humiliation because you're not used to Australian workplace culture. We're not trying to hurt your feelings. We're trying to make you better at your job." I asked if there was any training or resources to help American employees adjust to this feedback style. Sophie said no, because the expectation was that employees would adapt to company culture, not the other way around. She said several American employees had successfully adapted and now appreciated the direct feedback style. Others had left because they couldn't handle it. She said, "I needed to decide if I could adapt or if this company wasn't right for me." I tried to adapt. I really did. I told myself their feedback was meant to help, not hurt. I tried not to take it personally, but the constant barrage of harsh criticism wore me down. Every day, someone was telling me my work was lazy, boring, shit, uninspired, or just bad. Never once did anyone say my work was good or acknowledge when I did something right. When I asked Mark why he only gave negative feedback, he said, "Why would I waste time telling you something's good? You know when your work is good. I only need to tell you when it's not good enough so you can fix it." That philosophy was completely foreign to me. In American workplace culture, positive feedback is important. It motivates employees, builds confidence, and reinforces good behavior. You balance constructive criticism with recognition of strengths. But in this Australian company, positive feedback was seen as unnecessary coddling. They believed if you weren't being criticized, that meant you were doing fine. Silence was approval. The problem was, I never felt like I was doing fine. I constantly felt incompetent and inadequate because all I ever heard was criticism. My confidence was destroyed. I started second-guessing every idea, every presentation, every piece of work. I was stressed, anxious, and dreading going to work every day. After 3 weeks, I was a shell of the confident professional who'd started this job excited and eager. In my 3rd week, Mark called me into his office. He said my performance wasn't meeting expectations and they were letting me go during my probation period. I asked what specifically I'd done wrong. He said my work quality was inconsistent and I seemed unable to handle feedback without getting defensive and emotional. I said I wasn't getting defensive. I was trying to understand how to improve when all I received was harsh criticism without guidance. He said if I needed my hand held and couldn't figure out how to improve from direct feedback, this wasn't the right environment for me. I was fired 3 weeks into my dream job, not because I was incompetent, but because I couldn't adapt to a feedback culture that felt like constant attack. I left that office feeling like a failure. I questioned my entire career. Maybe I was too sensitive. Maybe I did need handholding. Maybe I wasn't as good at my job as I thought. I talked to my therapist about what happened. She helped me see that the issue wasn't my sensitivity or competence. The issue was a company transplanting Australian workplace culture into an American office without considering cultural context or legal implications. What Australians consider normal direct feedback, Americans often experience as verbal abuse and hostile work environment. Neither perspective is wrong, but they're incompatible. My therapist pointed out something important. Even if harsh feedback is culturally normal in Australia, employers operating in America need to follow American workplace laws and norms. Creating a work environment where employees are regularly called lazy, told their work is shit, and publicly humiliated in meetings could constitute hostile work environment under American employment law. The fact that it's normal in Australian culture doesn't make it legal or appropriate in American workplaces. I consulted an employment lawyer about wrongful termination. She said I might have a case for hostile work environment, but it would be difficult to prove because the company could argue it was cultural difference, not harassment. She said the bigger issue was that this Australian company was setting itself up for major legal problems if it didn't adapt its management style to American cultural and legal standards. Multiple American employees leaving or being fired for not adapting to harsh feedback culture could become a pattern of discrimination. I decided not to pursue legal action. I just wanted to move on, but I did leave detailed reviews on job sites warning other Americans about this company's culture. I was honest about my experience and advised people to ask about feedback culture during interviews. If you thrive on harsh, direct criticism with no positive reinforcement, this company might be great for you. If you need balanced feedback and professional communication, avoid this place. The reviews got attention. Several other former American employees commented with similar experiences. We'd all been told we were too sensitive, couldn't handle feedback, and weren't right for the company culture. A pattern emerged. The Australian company hired Americans, treated them like they would treat Australian employees, and then acted surprised when Americans couldn't adapt to what we experienced as verbal abuse. 6 months after I was fired, I heard the company was struggling to retain American employees. They'd gone through 3 people in my position. Word spread in the New York marketing community that this company was toxic. Their reputation suffered. They eventually had to hire a consultant to help them adapt their management style to American cultural norms. They learned the hard way that brutal honesty might work in Sydney but doesn't translate to New York. I found a new job at an American marketing firm with excellent workplace culture. My new boss gives clear, constructive feedback. When my work is good, she tells me. When it needs improvement, she explains specifically what to change and how. She gives feedback privately and professionally. Her approach builds my confidence and makes me want to do better work. I've thrived in this environment and received 2 promotions in 18 months. Looking back, I don't regret leaving that Australian company. I regret that I blamed myself initially for not being tough enough. The issue wasn't my weakness. The issue was an Australian company refusing to adapt to American workplace culture while demanding American employees adapt to Australian culture. That's not how cross-cultural business works. I learned that cultural differences in workplace communication are significant and can't be ignored. Australians value blunt, direct feedback and see softening language as dishonest and patronizing. Americans value diplomatic, constructive feedback and see harsh language as unprofessional and demoralizing. Neither approach is better or worse. They're different cultural values that create different work environments. But when a company operates internationally, it needs to adapt to local cultural norms and legal requirements. An Australian company operating in America can't just implement Australian workplace culture and fire Americans who can't adapt. That's cultural imperialism and potentially illegal discrimination. They need to find a middle ground that respects both direct communication values and American expectations for professional courtesy. The Australian company eventually figured this out. They kept their Australian office culture as it was, but modified their approach in the New York office. They trained Australian managers working in America on American workplace communication norms. They explained that what Australians consider normal feedback, Americans often interpret as hostile. They taught managers to balance negative feedback with positive recognition and to give criticism privately when possible. They also learned to be more explicit during hiring. They now tell American candidates about their direct feedback culture and ask if candidates are comfortable with that approach. They give examples of the kind of feedback employees receive. This transparency helps people self-select out if they know they won't thrive in that environment. It's better to lose a candidate during hiring than fire them after 3 weeks. I heard from a friend who interviewed there recently. She said they were very upfront about the feedback culture. They said if you need regular positive reinforcement and diplomatic communication, this isn't the right fit. If you prefer direct, unfiltered feedback and can separate your self-worth from criticism of your work, you'll thrive here. My friend appreciated the honesty and decided it wasn't for her. That's how it should work. The experience taught me to ask about feedback culture in every job interview. I now specifically ask how managers typically give constructive criticism. I ask for examples. I pay attention to how they describe their workplace culture. If they emphasize brutal honesty or we don't sugarcoat, I know that environment isn't for me. I need balanced feedback that includes recognition of strengths and specific guidance on improvements. I also learned that being told you're too sensitive is often gaslighting. If multiple people in the same situation have the same reaction, the problem isn't individual sensitivity. The problem is a workplace culture that doesn't work for a significant portion of employees. When an Australian company operating in America loses multiple American employees who report the same issues with harsh feedback, the problem is the company's refusal to adapt, not employees being too sensitive. The broader lesson is about respect in cross-cultural business. Respect means adapting your approach to the cultural context you're operating in. An American company operating in Australia should adapt to Australian directness. An Australian company operating in America should adapt to American communication norms. Neither culture needs to change at home, but both need flexibility when operating internationally. Brutal honesty isn't universal. What one culture sees as refreshing directness, another culture experiences as unnecessary cruelty. What one culture sees as helpful feedback, another sees as public humiliation. These aren't misunderstandings to overcome through toughness. These are genuine cultural differences that require mutual adaptation and respect. My career recovered. I'm successful, confident, and working in an environment where I thrive. But I'll never forget those 3 weeks of feeling incompetent and inadequate despite years of professional success. That's what happens when workplace culture prioritizes one communication style over employee well-being and performance. The Australian company's brutal honesty policy didn't make me a better marketer. It destroyed my confidence and drove me out. That's not good management. That's just cruelty with an accent.